The Mystery of the Mischievous Marker. A Mickey Wrangle Mystery. 1. This morning, I found myself sitting on the hot seat, yep, the principal's office. I don't mind telling you, it was working the way it's meant to work. I was sweating bullets. A fifth grader is never summoned to Mrs. Abrego's office just for the fun of it. Kids get called in for one of two reasons. They're either selling chocolate bars as a fundraiser for the student council, it was common knowledge that Mrs. O was a sucker for the almond variety, or they've done something they shouldn't have been doing, and they got caught. I wasn't in the student council, so that told me I wasn't there because Mrs. O was looking to satisfy her craving for candy bars. For the life of me, though, I could not come up with a reason why else I was sitting in this very uncomfortable leather chair. I hadn't done anything that warranted being pulled out of homeroom the moment I set foot in the classroom anyway. I was trying to remain calm, to stay cool. First rule of interrogation that I learned from my online course on private investigative techniques was, to keep them guessing, play it like Baby Bear, not too cool, not too hot, but just right. Okay, that pertained to the one asking the questions, but I figured it applied to the one getting grilled, too. Try as I might to be cool as a cucumber, though, I could not help but be nervous and know the jitters were beginning to show, and the sweat streaming down my face, my left eye twitching and my slight rocking back and forth. Without knowing my crime, it was obvious on my face I'd done it, whatever it was. It didn't help either that as soon as she asked me to take a seat she shuffled some papers on her desk, and without looking at me, said, "Sit tight, Wrangle. I'll be right back." She got up, walked to the door, stood there a few moments without saying a word, sighed, then left me alone in her office. Did I say she left me all by myself? In her office? Part of her grand master plan, I was sure of it. If, as a private detective, I ever needed to find out some key information on a case from a meanie, I'd leave him alone, too. Let him stew. Which was all good and well when you were the one stepping out, not the one left behind. It was nerve-wracking. Making matters worse was that overhead, running approximately the length of her desk, was a row of track lights, each of the fixtures pointed strategically at my face. 'Cause number 2 for my sweating like an ice cube on a South Texas summer day. In other words, bucket loads. To help pass the time, to help keep myself from throwing my body onto the floor in a fetal position like a baby sucking his thumb, I studied my surroundings. Something else I learned from my online courses, get to know where you're at, because wherever you find yourself, there you are. There I was, and so, first, I surveyed her desk, the sort of desk one would expect to find in principals' offices around the world, on the dark side of cherry wood, but most likely not actual wood but particle board instead. Covering the top was a sheet of clear glass, under which she kept photos, mostly of her children, if I had to guess. One of a boy and a little girl during what I surmised to be Halloween, because the boy was decked out in a zombie outfit and the little girl was dressed as a pink unicorn, both of them carrying their jack-o'-lantern baskets. His was the hard orange plastic variety, hers a soft plush. Across the bottom of the photo the names Aaron and Bella were written in clean block letters on a sticky note, followed by the year. The other photos were of the family and friends kind. Nothing really stuck out except for the one of the kids, which reminded me of mine and Ricky's Halloween this past year. I had made an oversized stool out of cardboard. I had cut a hole on the seat to fit my head through. Ricky, my twin brother, dressed like a pigeon, though most people where we trick-or-treated mistook him for a turkey. They just didn't get the joke. More times than not, we had to explain it. You see, I'm a stool, Ricky's a pigeon. So, we're a stool pigeon. Get it? You know, the bad guy in crime novels who's a tattletale? It was really disappointing after all the work we put into our costumes. I think we decided that if we go out next Halloween, we'd dress up as superheroes. In addition to the papers Mrs. A had shuffled earlier, there were also a stapler on the desk, a nameplate and a letter opener that looked like a mini-sword. The stack of papers was face down, close enough for me to take a peek if I were curious like a cat with all 9 lives to spare. I still had no idea why I was there, so I wasn't taking any chances. However, I'd armed myself with every other possible detail available to me. The plants on each side of the window right behind her chair were fake, and by the looks of them, shiny like they were, Mrs. O was a clean freak. Most of those do nothing but gather dust. Hanging from the walls were the appropriate number and kinds of framed items, diplomas, pictures of Mrs. A shaking hands with important-looking people, certificates, awards, and a crayon-based piece of artwork, the sort my mother kept on the fridge to this day from Ricky's in my younger days. I was tempted to take a closer look at her diplomas to see for myself when and where she graduated, and just as I was shifting my weight onto my feet to stand, the doorknob turned with a slight squeak. Then the door opened wide. I collapsed back into my chair. From the look on her face, I knew I was done for. I felt like a stuck pig at a barbecue convention. 2. Mrs. Abrego sat behind her desk, flipped the stack of papers from earlier, rifled through them, reordered a few, all the while saying nothing. Long moments passed. The light seemed brighter and hotter on my face now that she was back. I tried not to, but I couldn't help swallowing hard and loud. The longer the silence, the bigger the crime, I thought. All I could come up with under this pressure was the spitball fight on the bus from this morning. I needed a plan of attack, and fast, but my mind was sluggish. I'd never been on this side of the interrogation before. I had no clue how to devise said plan of attack. So, said Mrs. A, training her gaze on me, finally. With those eyes leveled right at me now, I actually preferred the long quiet without her looking at me. You must be wondering why I've called you to my office, she said. She was deadly cold in her approach. Such a pro. I knew if this took any longer, I would crack like a nut. I'd confess to whatever she accused me of. And oh, that stare. Now my right leg was betraying me, too. It was shaking noticeably. Sort of, I said. To be honest, I've been going over in my head what I could have possibly done, what trouble I could have gotten into to merit being called to your office, ma'am. Although there was that spitball incident from this morning on the bus, it was only just this morning and mostly between Ricky and me, so word couldn't have reached you so quickly, and even if it had, I would argue that my actions weren't so bad that. I stopped mid-sentence when I saw her reach for a pen and then begin taking notes. What I mean to say, ma'am, is, no, I can't think of anything, period. I mean, yes, ma'am, I have been wondering why you would call me here. There was a slight smile on her face, though it didn't have to be one. It could have been just that look all principals share, the stern smirk used to confuse students. She laid down the pen and leaned back in her chair. It squeaked like the door had. No matter the outcome, I'd have to recommend squirting a bit of oil on them. Unless, of course, it was part of her principal's ruse, a means of throwing students off balance with the annoying screeches. She was a wily one, this Mrs. A. Well, she said, never mind about the, spitball episode, at least for now. Again with the smile/smirk. As to why I've asked you to my office, Mr. Wrangle, she continued, may I call you Mickey? Certainly, ma'am, I said, maybe a little too eagerly. But I needed to get her on my side, especially when I didn't know my crime. She looked briefly at the papers, then back at me with a soft, sad face this time. Mickey, I'm sure you've seen the graffiti marring our walls lately. Of course, we try and have them cleaned up before any of you get a chance to see the ugliness, but you can't get rid of the marker completely. Anyhow, the substance of the messages, aimed primarily at me, is fairly harmless. I'm a principal, after all, so I've grown a thick skin over the years, sticks and stones, you know? What is bothersome beyond belief, though, is that someone thinks so very little of our school that they would show such disrespect. Not just to me, but to all of us. I'm proud of our school, Mickey. I count myself fortunate to be principal here. So it's heartbreaking when something like this happens. She shook her head, and for the first time since looking at me she dropped her eyes. It all of a sudden hit me why I was here. I partway stood. Mrs. Abrego, you don't think that you can't believe me? She snapped her head up, leaned forward, put a hand to her heart and she shook her other one. Oh, goodness, no, Mickey. I'm sorry I haven't been clear. Please, sit. I did. She leaned back, too. No, I don't think for a second you have anything to do with this ugliness. When my racing mind slowed down and I was able to process what Mrs. A had just said, I sighed in relief. Then a split moment later, I asked, so, then why am I here, if you don't mind me asking? Am I right in saying you're a sort of detective, young though you are? Actually, Mrs. Abrego, I said, I'm the real deal. I've taken several online courses. I took and passed every one of their tests, and they sent me a certificate, which I've got at home, framed if you want to see it. I pulled my wallet from my back pocket, removed my private ID card, and reached across the desk as far as my 5th grade arm could reach to show it to her. I've got a badge, too. Want to see? She took it from me, scanned it briefly, turned it over for an even shorter time, then handed it to me. That's very impressive, Mickey. Thank you, ma'am. But I still don't understand why I'm here. Mickey, she said, I'll be frank with you. I was so tempted to say, and I'll be surely with you, but I thought this would be the absolutely wrong time for my joke. So I kept my mouth shut for the time being. She continued, I'm in a bit of a sticky situation. She grabbed the stack of papers, stood, and walked to the window overlooking the playground, a blacktop covered in hopscotch and 4 square courts, a couple of basketball hoops, and not much else. It's where we played ultimate dodgeball during P2. It was her turn to sigh. After what looked like thinking hard on her part, she invited me to the window. I made my way around her desk to the window and stood beside her, looking at the pre-K classes running around in circles with multicolored streamers flitting from their chubby fists. Mrs. A then said, Take a good look out this window with me, Mickey, and tell me what you see. I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am. For instance, she said, do you see Mr. Button out there scrubbing the wall? I nodded. His bright orange janitor's supply cart was parked right beside him. He'd be hard to miss. If you look closer, you'll see he's trying to get rid of the latest message, but to no avail. That one wheel. Have to paint over, it looks like. You can still read it, can't you? I read it aloud, our principal's no pal of nobodies. It was interesting spelling and punctuation choices this mischievous marker had made. It hadn't taken me but an instant to come up with a nickname for the baddie, and just like that, I knew why I was here. Mrs. A needed my help in finding out who the culprit was so she could clean up the school, so to speak. I take it you noticed the errors in grammar and punctuation. It should read principal, ending in PAL, not PLE. Major difference, as you well should know if you've been paying attention in Mrs. Garza's English class. I had been, and then some. I added, that is the most obvious error, ma'am. But there's also the nobody, that is spelled as though it were plural, ending in IES, though to the trained eye, which mine is, the word is only made to look like the plural form of the word, though it should be singular. And though there is an apostrophe, it's in the wrong position. Errors abound. I was enjoying analyzing everything wrong with the message. I was eager for her to ask me to join, if not outright lead, her investigative team. I felt I'd more than proven my mettle in this short time. So many clues. I said. Oh, is that a B at the bottom right corner, almost like a signature? You caught that, too? Most impressive, Mickey. Thanks, ma'am. I was glad she'd caught that. I also got an anonymous email this morning right as I turned on my computer. The author claims to be an eyewitness to the wrongdoing. What can you make of it? She handed me the sheet of paper. I gave it a quick scan. I said, incriminating, to say the least. So the letter B on the wall would make sense then. I couldn't believe she hadn't already solved this crime on her own. She was a principal after all, with at least 2 college degrees, and she hadn't seen the answer that was right there under her nose. No wonder she needed my help. Based on the overabundance of clues, all fingers sure do point to none other than Bucho. Yes, I was thinking the same exact thing, Mickey, but here's the thing, she said, and paused. I held my breath for what would come next, and then she said, let's sit back down. Aga! The dreaded dramatic pause. 3, sitting across from one another again, Mrs. A said, you see, Mickey, I've already spoken with Bucho. He left a few minutes before you got here. I confronted him with this supposed evidence, and he denies having anything to do with marking up the walls. Believe it or not, despite his tough attitude, he was nearly in tears. Bucho, my lifelong arch-nemesis, in tears. I didn't believe it, not for a second. He never cried. Never. And if he were shedding tears, I just knew they were crocodile tears. He'd have an ulterior motive. He always had some trick up his sleeve. I'd seen it before, a bully crying to a teacher so as not to get punished too severely for being a tyrant on the blacktop, or a kid yammering about this or that to get out of taking a test. And every time it was to gain the upper hand. I had no doubt Bucho was pulling the same kind of stunt on Mrs. A, and I felt bad for her because she was supposed to be smarter than to allow herself to be taken advantage of. She must be a softie despite her glare, I thought. Ma'am, I told her, I don't think you should be telling me any of this. Isn't there some kind of student-principal confidentiality code, like between a doctor and her patient, or a man of the cloth and the sinner? Normally, yes, but he gave me permission to discuss this matter with you, every bit of it. Wait, what? You mean he told you it was okay to talk to me about this? Why would he do that? She shrugged her shoulders, as though she couldn't believe it either. Mickey, Bucho was so adamant that he wasn't the culprit that he recommended I bring you in on the case. He's the one, as a matter of fact, who told me you were a detective, a very good one. He said that if anyone could prove his innocence, it'd be you. I had to hold my jaw closed. This was unbelievable. He said that? Are you surprised? Was I ever? Duh, I said. I mean, yeah. I mean, yes, ma'am, I am. You might not know this about us, but he and I have a history. We are not the best of friends. To tell the truth, since childhood, even though we live in the same neighborhood, we've never been friends. To be honest, Mrs. Abrego, he's a bit of a bully. I was sounding just like a stool pigeon right then. That he is. And more than just a bit of one. But he and I have been trying to work on that part of his life. In the last few weeks he's made some great strides, but when I got this email and put it together with the so-called B signature, it was easy even for me to jump to conclusions, she said. It didn't look good for Bucho, I thought. It may be easy to assume his guilt based on these obvious clues and his prior actions, said Mrs. A, but I'm still a firm believer in our American justice system, he's innocent. Until proven guilty, I finished this great truth for her. Mrs. A nodded. And so this is where you come in, Mickey. I was filled with indecision about what I should do about this, but now I think I've found an answer. Bucho has so much confidence in you to uncover the truth that I'm asking you for your assistance. I need you to find out who, if not Butcho, is to blame for the graffiti. She paused. Can you help me? I was so busy rereading the email that I'd stopped listening to Mrs. A few words ago. Mickey, she said. I pinched my chin in thought, looked up at her then, and said, interesting. Most interesting. What's interesting? Did you find something? Oh, it's probably nothing, ma'am, I said. Probably nothing. As for your request, I'm in. Mickey Wrangle is on the case. Good, then, she said, leaning back in her chair. I knew I could count on you. Whatever you need from me, please don't hesitate to ask. 4. Though it had been nearly 3 hours since my meeting in Mrs. Abrego's office, I really hadn't had the time to scrutinize the facts of this case. And now it was lunchtime. Something else that seemed odd, there'd been no communication of any type from my so-called angel. Normally, this person would have already sent me some kind of note-a riddle folded up into an origami frog, a puzzle drawn onto a scrap piece of cardboard, a text message. This person obviously thought I couldn't get the job done on my own. So he or she sent me clues. Thing of it is, I had no idea who it was. Anyhow, I guess he or she was absent today, not paying attention, or stumped for once. Just as well, I knew I could easily solve this mystery on my own. I would solve it by myself and prove to this angel and myself that I was the real deal, a true gumshoe. As usual, I sat with my brother, Ricky, who was zonked out. He'd stayed up late studying for exams, and it was obvious it had caught up with him. The moment we sat at our regular table, he pushed his tray a few inches forward, planted his forehead on his bent arms, and fell asleep. Well, at least I'd get the quiet time I needed to study the case. I leaned in and whispered, more like mouthed the words, "Are you going to eat that, Ricky?" I waited a few short moments, and when he didn't stir, I snagged Ricky's brownie. Didn't think you would, so I'm sure you won't mind if I help myself? I ate it in 2 bites. Thanks, little brother. How about this? I took his fruit cup this time. You're so generous. Just as I was swallowing the last of the peach cubes, someone shoved my chair from behind. I almost choked. It was Butcho. No surprise there. I guessed all this work he and Mrs. A had been doing to improve his behavior didn't include nearly plugging up my airway with fruit. He set his tray on the table, to my right. I'm thinking you won't mind if I sit with you, and really, who cares if you do? I don't, so I'm going to sit wherever I like. He turned the chair backwards and straddled it like it was a horse. I made a mental note to perhaps suggest to Mrs. A that they also work on Butcho's table manners. I took a swallow of my milk. Sure, I said. Make yourself at home. Whatever, he said, then pointed over at Ricky with his thumb. What's his problem? You mean Ricky? Butcho snorted, looked around the table from chair to chair. Is there somebody else sitting here with his head practically in his lunch tray right out? Where I'm pointing? Of course, Ricky. Why is he out? He had a long night, I told him. He was studying for his history test today, and he worked on memorizing his poem for English, too. Which one? Butcho asked and stuffed his whole brownie into his mouth. Which one what? Butcho shook his head and finally swallowed his brownie. What's with you? You got rocks for brains? Don't let me regret asking Mrs. Abrego to bring you in on the case. You can't be that dense. I mean, what poem is your brother memorizing? He rammed a forkful of mashed potato and roast beef down his gullet. Kind of gross if you ask me. But I wasn't going to say anything about it. Oh, that. Sure, it's Mending Wall by Robert Frost. I took another drink of milk. Oh yeah, that's a good one. Okay, I had to cough up some of the milk. I had my doubts that Butcho read, much less read poetry, much less the poetry of Robert Frost. Maybe some limericks or some nonsense poems, but not the real stuff. Again, I kept these thoughts to myself and swallowed the milk I'd just regurgitated. What? You think I don't like poetry just because you and everybody else says I'm a bully? I'll tell you what, I do like poetry. But I'll tell you a second thing, if word gets out, you'll live to regret it. Butcho made a fist and thrust it just under my nose. If you know what I mean. I did, so I said, your secret's safe with me. I made like I locked my lips with a key and threw it away, then I zipped my lips shut on top of that. What are you, 5 years old? Anyway, I imagine Mrs. A told you the story. Somebody's trying to frame me for this rash of graffiti, and I bet you won't believe me, but I'm telling you nothing but the facts. It wasn't me, and for some reason, you're the only one I have faith in to uncover the truth. I raised a finger to say something, but Butcho cut me off. Yeah, I've heard you say it a million times, a guy who says over and over again he didn't do it most likely did. In my case, the fact I'm asking for your help should be proof I'm telling you the truth. It isn't me. Even with Mrs. A's assurances it wasn't him, this was Butcho, who knew his way around trouble. He knew how to get into, and how to get out of it. So, if not you, then who? I asked, though I meant, likely story. I don't know, Butcho answered. You're the detective, figure it out. Normally, I'd ask, who has it in for you? But. Yeah, that list is never ending, he said. I chuckled, he didn't. So I stopped. He looked serious now. Which is why you've just got to help me, Mickey, he said. I'm not making any promises, Butcho, but like I told Mrs. A, I'll do my best. Well, try better than your best. Or else. He stood, put a hand on my shoulder, leaned in with his stinky breath, and said, You going to eat that? He reached for my brownie that I was saving for the end and scarfed it down in one bite, dropping only a few crumbs on my papers. He walked away with the tray in his hand. It's a good thing I'd already snagged Ricky's brownie because they weren't half bad. I brushed off the crumbs, and that's when I thought of something. Hey, Butcho, I called after him. I was on to something. Tell me, how do you spell principal? As in, Mrs. Abrego, the school's big cheese? Butcho stared at me. First, are you kidding me? Are you some kind of dumb? What other kind of principal is there but the kind who sits in her office looking for ways to send you to detention? You making fun of me? Because if you are. He shook a fist in the general direction of my nose. I shook my head no in response. Well, good like I can't spell the word. It's all part of the investigation. So spell it. He looked scowling mad. Principal. He spelled out, exaggerating the pronunciation of each letter. As in, Mrs. Abrego is our pal. Satisfied? I smiled. Yup. How about spelling its homonym? Keep it up, genius. You won't trip me up on this. Like there are two kinds of principals? What a nitwit. He turned again, and again I called out his name. He spun to face me. He walked toward me. I was in fear for my life, but I couldn't move. You're getting on my last nerve, Wrangle. What do you want? Well, back to who it might be who's framing you. I hated when people use the air quotation marks to make a point, but for some unknown reason I used them on the word framed. So, what are you waiting for? The way I figure it, whoever's doing this to you has got to have it in for you big time. So who have you upset recently? Beyond the usual characters, I said. He scrunched up his lips and thought. I think. After a few moments, he said, well, there is Fido. Last month he put the moves on Toots, my girl, you know? And I had to set him straight. Just because she and I were broken up at the time, he should have known better than to go after another guy's prize, right? You wouldn't do that, would you, Mickey? I gulped and shook my head. Toots Rodriguez was among the prettiest girls in the 5th grade, and like he said, they were an item. No one came anywhere near her. No one, that is, but Fido. But Fido and me are good now. We talked it out, and we shook hands after. So your gut instinct is wrong. It's not him. He's my friend. So look someplace else, and Toots and I are like butter and toast made for each other. He told me more stuff, but I'd stopped listening because I was sidetracked thinking about her pretty eyes, her long curly hair and her feather-soft fingers from the one and only time she actually talked to me. It had to do with making up and buying her a trinket as a token of his love, and a special pen. When I came back to myself, Butcho had walked away, this time for good. I looked over at Ricky, who had drooled on the table. Well, Ricky, I can't say for sure who the mischievous marker is, but I think I can prove Butcho is not guilty. Question is, what's the worst that can happen if I keep this information to myself? Walking with Ricky's and my trays to the tray return, I was conflicted. On the one hand, I had proof that would clear Butcho beyond reasonable doubt. On the other, he was not completely free from blame. You asked 100 of my classmates who they thought was leaving all these ugly messages on our walls, 100 of them would say, Butcho, naturally. But a survey wasn't evidence, even though he did spend all his time harassing me and so many of my friends. It would be that easy to let him take the fall. After all, he deserved to pay some kind of price, and this could be the way. I could just keep my mouth shut, tell Mrs. A I wasn't able to discover who'd marked up the school's walls. Withholding information isn't outright lying. Not really. I hadn't uncovered yet who the culprit was, and no one but me would know I'd stopped actively looking. So I'd leave out the part about my concluding it wasn't Butcho. If she didn't bring it up, I'd say no more. Easy as pie. It would fall to Mrs. A to make the final decision. All the evidence clearly suggested it was Butcho who'd been marking up the school's walls. Her first suspicion was that Butcho had done it. She'd come to that same conclusion if I didn't prod her in another direction. So, if Mrs. O were to punish him, wrongly though it might be, didn't he really and truly deserve whatever he got coming to him? Best case scenario would be suspension. We wouldn't have to deal with him at school. Worst case? A week of in-school detention, which meant at least a week of him out of our hair. Win-win. When I went back to the table, Ricky was already gone. And I had a lot to think about, including the fact that my so-called angel hadn't yet stuck his or her nose in my investigation. Fine by me, as I was doing very well without the nosy angel's interference. And though I wasn't speaking aloud, I used the air quotation marks again. 5. In the end, my conscience won out. I'd not only tell Mrs. Abrego about why it couldn't possibly be Butcho doing all the graffiti, but I'd also expose the mischievous marker. Even if no one ever found out I'd not given this case 100%, I'd know, and I'd be a crummy sort of private detective. I'd never be able to look myself in the mirror. I think I was just suffering from wishful thinking itis after lunch. And, it turns out, there was someone besides me who knew my innermost thoughts, that ever medley some angel. How he or she knew I was having doubts about Butcho I don't know, but he or she did. Kind of spooky, if you ask me. Anyway, I got an email right when I almost had it all solved, which is how the notes always worked out. I was on the verge of unraveling it all on my own, I tell you. I'd narrowed it down to just a dozen possibilities, give or take, and by tomorrow morning, was sure to have figured it all out. Here's what I'd concluded so far. I excluded any kinder through fourth graders because they'd not studied homonyms nor idioms in their classes yet. We in the 5th grade had, and at that level there were only 3 English language arts teachers. I easily eliminated a huge chunk of these students for the fact that they already bore the brunt of Bucho's bullying, and fearing retaliation they would not intentionally set themselves up for it. I counted myself among this group. That left people who were friends with him, like I'd mentioned to him at lunch, or enemies with a grudge of their own. I was sitting at the computer working out a Sudoku puzzle to unclutter my mind, to get a better and clearer grasp of all these people when my computer dinged. I had an email from your angel. The truth? I was actually relieved. I needed the distraction. I clicked the email open. What could it hurt? Here's what the email said. The handwriting on the wall doesn't belong to our busy, buzzy, bully bee, like one would think. For one, the mistakes take too much of a cautious hand, the errors are too smart. Second, as happens usually in such matters of mystery, X marks the spot, or the wall, as the case might be. This time find the culprit by looking at a former pal. And third, I'm certain you'll act on principle. The angel was losing his or her edge, handwriting on the wall too easy. And the alliteration, B, must be a poetry unit overdose. And X, as in X versus P, or wrong spelling versus right spelling, put that together with the bit about the cautious hand, and I know to look at the deliberate mistakes. Although why not just X as opposed to X, the prefix meaning former? As in, ex-girlfriend? But Bucho had told me they were back together after a 30-minute breakup. He'd bought her another charm for her bracelet, a little bowling pin, he'd said. Too smart, the angel emailed. Of course, too smart for Bucho. And, I should be looking at his inner circle for the culprit. In particular, one on the outs. Just as I had suspected. First thing I did when we got back to Mrs. Garza's class was pull Bucho aside. Bucho? Okay, you got me. I looked it up. There's 2 kinds of principles, if you must know. The one ending in PAL and the other ending on PLE. Happy now? Impressed, yes. But that's not what I need to talk to you about. So, what then? As we waited for the bell to ring, we hid ourselves away in a corner. I asked, tell me this, is there anyone else besides Fido you've had a falling out with recently? Hard to say. It changes from day to day. I wouldn't doubt it, I told him. He curled his lip at me and growled. Okay, I said. Let's look at those who are, how can I say this? Smart. Why didn't you say so? That list is short to begin with. I mean, can you imagine a guy like me hanging out with bookworms and nerds? Without thinking I said, nope. And immediately I winced and readied myself for the punch that never came. In place of the curled lip and growl combo, Bucho smiled, like it was a badge of honor, as if I had just complimented him. But I let it go. Anyway, the list? It was a short list, to be sure. In fact, the list consisted of just one name. What's this all about? Bucho asked. Well, I said, but just then the bell rang and Mrs. Garza was at the front of the class taking roll. We'll talk later, I said, and left Bucho in the dark. 6. I strode down the sidewalk leading to the playground. The moment I'd solved the crime, I asked permission to visit Mrs. Abrego's office. She was taking a late lunch, a gyro wrap, chips, a side of coleslaw and a Diet Cola. With her mouth full she said, "Sit, Mickey, sit, please." Which I did. And though I knew I wasn't there because I was in trouble, I still felt a bit uneasy. This was, after all, the principal's office, the hot seat. What have you found out? Enough to call for a meeting, if you don't mind. I explained to her that though I knew who the culprit was, I couldn't just then divulge the information. I needed to publicly confront said baddie, preferably in Mrs. A's presence. I needed to walk us all through the crime, step by step, like real detectives always did in TV shows. I gave her the list of people who needed to be present. After she studied it carefully, she said, "Well, that'll be easy to manage. It's me and Butcho on your list." But I thought, well, it is what it is if that's what it is. I trust that you know what you're doing. She sounded disappointed, and why shouldn't she be? From the tiny bit of information I'd given her, she could only deduce one thing, that she'd been wrong about Butcho. And, want as I did, I couldn't yet reveal anything more. Not until I revealed it all on the playground in front of her and Butcho. She began typing on her computer. When she was done, she turned to me. "It looks like you and Butcho are both in recess in about 15 minutes. I'll hurry with my lunch and meet you there. How does that sound?" "Perfect," I told her. I couldn't have planned it any better, because we weren't the only ones on the playground at the same time. So was the mischievous marker. In a quarter of an hour, I would unmask the guilty party. Now, it was 15 minutes later. As soon as I turned the corner heading to the black top, Mrs. A said, "There you are, Mickey. I'm sure you didn't mean to keep Butcho and me waiting. Here we are, so can we get started?" "Sure thing, Principal Abrego." Before speaking, I scanned the scene. Standing left to right in front of me were Mrs. A and Butcho, but they were simply bystanders, as it were, serving as props. Just beyond them several kids played different recess games, among them Fido, who was conspicuously keeping a careful eye on the developments from a safe distance. "First of all, Mrs. A, you'll be happy to know you were right. In the case of the mischievous marker, someone other than Butcho is responsible for this graffiti, which means he is being framed." The two breathed a collective sigh of relief. My first clue was the curious spelling in the graffiti. Only 2 days ago in English we were studying vocabulary. Homonyms to be exact. One set of words we were asked to learn included the principal/principal set. Butcho nodded. "That's right," he said. "Mrs. Garza even taught us the trick to remembering how to spell one of them. Mrs. Abrego, our principal, is our pal. Like I told you at lunch, Mickey." "Exactly, but at lunch you also said there was only one spelling for principal, when in fact there are two. Even so, at lunch, when it counted for something, you had no idea about the other, principle, meaning a high standard that guides one's actions, reactions, and decisions. You were like a deer caught in the headlights, clueless. You must have been contemplating the insides of your eyelids when Mrs. Garza was going over that one, huh, Butcho? Though kudos to you for discovering this on your own after lunch." "What did you just call me?" "Nothing. I said kudos to you. That means, never mind. You can look it up yourself later now that you know how." "Watch yourself," he threatened. "No, watch yourself, Burnaby, I mean Butcho. Mickey's trying to help, so help yourself by keeping calm. And you, Mickey, go easy on the sarcasm." We both said, "Yes, ma'am." But I couldn't help myself. "Burnaby, really?" "Too easy." Butcho scowled and took an ominous step in my direction. I took a quick step backward. Okay. Allow me to go on. If you didn't know how to spell both words, much less that a second variation existed, then you couldn't have put up this morning's graffiti. At this point, I passed the photo to Mrs. A, who shared it with Bucho. You'll notice the spelling and the use of the mnemonic device too. This indicates to me that our culprit is also studying vocabulary in Mrs. Garza's class. And he was also very awake during the whole lesson, unlike others. Mrs. A cleared her throat. Yes, ma'am, I said. Sorry, Berna. Bucho. Apology accepted, but not accepted. No pun intended, he said. I must have looked dumbfounded because Bucho felt he had to explain further. Except you know? Like hominies. Hello. Who's the dear now? I shook my head to clear it, and I noticed Mrs. A had to turn away to hide her smile. When Mrs. A and I had regained our composure, Bucho said, Well, spit it out, if it wasn't me, then who? I shared with them what the angel had emailed me, though I would have come to those conclusions by myself. I also told them my interpretation of the note. When I finished walking them through the evidence, I said, Excuse me a moment. I walked over to where the kids were playing. Hey, Fido, can you come with me, please? What's up, Mickey? He said as he walked in the direction of Mrs. A and Bucho. He was holding a basketball under his left arm, but a look of preoccupation covered his face. We need some help on a spelling issue. I think you're just the person to clear it up for us. Cool, he said, smiling, never suspecting a thing. Mrs. A, you know Fido, don't you? Mickey, of course I do. I know all my students. Of course you do, ma'am. Fido, like I said, we need some help with a language issue. Can you spell the word principal for us, as in Mrs. Abrego, the school's administrator? Are you kidding me? He looked relieved now, like he was off the hook. One thing I noticed was that he had yet to acknowledge Bucho's existence, a sign that he and Bucho were no longer BFFs. Humor him, Fido, said Mrs. A. Fido puffed his chest out proudly. He spun the basketball on his index finger. Sure thing, then, PRINCIPLE, principal, as in the last thing I want is to be sent to the principal's office. Happy? Quite, I said. Though not so smart. On that point, both the angel and I had been wrong, but I wasn't telling. It wasn't all intentional word choice and spelling after all. He must have been sleeping the other half of the homonym lesson. Put the two lunkheads together and they might get a right answer on a quiz, but the dynamic duo they were not. Quite indeed, she said. Mickey, thanks for your good work. Bucho, we'll see you after school for our usual meeting? Thank you, I said. I'll be there with bells on, Bucho said, his words dripping with sarcasm. Tisk, tisk, Mrs. A said. I mean, yes, ma'am, I'll be there. Thank you, Mrs. A said, then turned to Fido, who looked very confused. Young man, though it's the last thing you want to do, you will follow me to my office. We have some matters to discuss. Fido dropped the ball in his shoulders and struggled alongside Mrs. A. He'd done the crime, now he'd do his time. I'd solved another case, and though I was happy for that, I was happier that in the end, I'd done the right thing. I'd acted on principle, like the angel wrote in his email. I bent to grab the ball and that's when I noticed Mrs. A had put an arm around Fido's shoulders, which told me she was going to work with him in the same way as she was with Bucho. I fought the urge to use air quotation marks again. The third time in a day. Mickey, you did it. You proved my innocence. He was all smiles. That'll teach you to judge me like a book, which I ain't. I also proved you won't ever win a spelling bee. Bucho looked to make sure Mrs. A was out of sight before taking a menacing step toward me. Why, I oughta. I cringed for no reason. Bucho didn't follow up his wrinkled face with a punch. He laughed. I said, when you told me who of your closest friends was smart, you said Fido. Just Fido. You were partly correct. Bucho looked perplexed. Fido is smarter, but not really smart. Bucho smiled big. Didn't I tell you? He turned on his heels and walked to the closest game of Foursquare. I shook my head and chuckled. Bucho was a piece of work. A very dull piece of work.